Welcome everybody. This is one of the newest 2023 sessions we have the Service Design Network Data chapter. We are today going to be taking a really close look at real life situation of service design. We try to navigate the academic portion of service design, the blueprinting and stakeholder and stuff like that. But also once in a while we try to dig into an actual client or company actually is doing service design to see exactly how they're doing this, the challenges they have, issues they have, and kind of like get some tips from them on how we can actually use some of those experiences into our own lines of work and clients. So today we're going to be taking a look at the wonderful world of Spotify. So let's do some really quick introductions. As always, thank you to our sponsors, Slalom and Precocity, who are allowing us to broadcast all over the world using the Zoom features, and have been a sponsor with us for several years now. So thank you again to Slalom and Precocity. Quick introduction, I am Greg Lactufi, I work at Slalom. Brandon with us is at Precocity, Robin is at Capital One, and Brenda, who's actually not with us today, she works at GM Financial. Also, quick heads up that this is being recorded. We have recorded all past, I think, 40 or 50 past sessions. So if you're going to go to the YouTube channel of Service Design Network Data chapter, you can catch up with the Service Design Masters, Mark, Adam, Erica, Jim, Andy. Quite a few content to be available if you want to look into some of the past sessions, the past 2 or 3 years, and educate yourself on service design or just catch up with us. Quickly, we just discussed with Brendan that we're going to try a new feature today in Zoom that they just rolled out recently. In the past, we have asked you to go into the regular Zoom Q&A window and kind of engage with each other like you've been doing so far, introducing yourself. You can still do so. But now there is an actual Zoom Q&A window that you probably have. There's a button called Q&A in your interface. If you click on Q&A, it will open a new window, and that would be specifically managed by Brendan and Robin around questions for our speakers. So you will be able to ask questions directly to Marco, Rebecca, and Grace at the end of the Q&A session. So please use that. If you have that feature, you need to have the most recent Zoom interface. So if you don't have it, this will not work for you. But if you can, just go into the Q&A window, pop it up, and ask questions to the panel, and we will monitor that throughout the session, and we can ask them questions at the end. The main Zoom chat is still for regular engagement and chatting and sharing thoughts and questions within yourselves. So let's try to see if that works out for us. Now we're going to talk about Spotify today. And we have today Grace, Rebecca, and Marco, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself. Grace is joining us from New York, Brooklyn. Rebecca from DC, and Marco from Spain. Who wants to start? Grace, you want to start? Tell us a bit about you.
Sure. Hello. Super excited to be here. My name is Grace Kwon, currently in New York. I think my service design journey started when I was really curious about design beyond the visual. And so working and sneaking into a lot of business classes where I'm not supposed to, talking to a lot of folks who are beyond making was really, really interesting for me. But again, excited to chat more about Spotify and everything else. I'm going to pass it to Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Stonebraker. Also excited to be here. I started off my career as a graphic designer, so more visual end of the spectrum, doing a lot of branding work, and then transitioned into general UX design, where I learned all the different things and got really into research and started using service design practices as part of my normal process. So it just kind of became embedded in how I do my work. And especially just in service design, which is great, and I love it, and it fits how my brain works. So I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about it today.
Very cool. And last but not least, Marco.
Hello, this is Marco. My background is actually in interaction design, and I started as an interaction and product UX designer, I've always been very interested in understanding like the why of things, and like looking at especially like the context of products and especially digital products. And that kind of naturally led me towards a path of doing more service design. And especially in the last few years at Spotify, that's been my main role.
Cool, very cool. So I'm going to do a very quick intro about Spotify, just in case people don't know what it is. Also to understand the large footprint of Spotify in the world, right? So it's only a 14-year-old company, so it's definitely what we call a digital darling, right? So it's launched in 2008. They have 489 million users, 205 million of them are premium users, over 10,000 employees, 15 offices, distributed workforce, 11 billion revenue euros, present in 184 markets. And in the US, they have 31% of the market share. Just in reference, Apple is 15 and Amazon is 13%. So a very significant player on the stage of the music streaming. And we're going to take a look at how they organize around service design with our three guests today. So the first question for the three guests, what does service design look like at Spotify? What are you solving for, right? So Spotify is a service as a whole. So you would think that what else can you possibly do on top of just streaming music, right? So we're talking about, for example, compliance, product design, IP law licensing, right? So tell us, you probably are working on different projects, I'm assuming. So just tell us what you're working on, and then please share your experience and knowledge with our attendees, starting with Grace.
Sure. Our community is super nitty gritty. We meet monthly to kind of go over what we're working on, but also just share some of our stories and tools. As you mentioned, everyone has a different pathway, a different idea, different tool sets. And so as a community, we gather about 40 to 50 folks in the guild now, the Service Design Guild. And specifically, everyone's kind of solving for something else. I think not really everyone works together within the Service Design Guild. They're specifically tied to a different business unit. For me, I work in a unit called Business Affairs, where I work with a lot of licensing, legal folks, finance folks to figure out everything in the backstage. That's a little bit of an overview from my end. Marco or Rebecca, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I work in a very different space from Grace and Marco. I work in an area of the business that's more on the actual product itself, but we have a mix of internal tools and external tools. And so my focus is kind of bridging across those experiences to understand what the listener is experiencing in the world of messaging. So that's my specific focus, is messages that can look like emails or push notifications or different communications within the application itself. So that's where I use service design to bridge the technical aspects, the human side, where people are creating certain messages for our listeners to help educate and teach you how to use the app, or tell you about special offers, or many different things. And then also the machine learning that goes into that as well, and many aspects to that.
And in my case, I am part of what is called the experience mission, which basically looks at overall the listener and the creator experience at Spotify. So all of the actual products. And within that organization specifically, I work in a part of the org is called integrity. So my focus is basically in making sure that whatever is in Spotify is appropriate, and that it's a safe platform for both consumers and creators to interact, share their voice, and so forth and so on. So my work tends to be a little bit more internally focused. So it means my direct customers tend to be other teams within Spotify, but we also have some touch points that directly add to the consumer and the creator experience.
It seems like there has been a huge increase of service design needs at Spotify, right? So it used to be a couple of people not that long ago, and now it was like, I think, over 30 people like within 12 months. So can you tell us, without telling us the secret, so like, why is there such a huge rise of service design practitioners within Spotify recently? What has been the trigger to actually bring more service design discipline, I would say, within Spotify.
I can hop
Rebecca?
on. Oh,
Right? Go.
I'll pass it to Rebecca after. After our blog post went out, a lot of other in-house design folks have reached out. There are brands that you love and know. And speaking to them as well, I think there's this energy coming out about kind of maintaining a product. Now that something has been successful, how do we kind of prolong the effect, but also the impact of something? And so in order to do that, we have to get a lot of ducks in the row and make decisions in alignment. And I think the maturity around design thinking and service design is totally, totally growing. And so in terms of understanding the need for the business case of design, but also just the back end, everything that you don't see in the front end is just like the maturity of understanding the depth is currently like here, the timing is now. And so speaking to those folks, but also internally, we know that for everything to be robust for the future, not innovation just happening all the time, we have to think about scale, but also the responsibility we have for certain things. And so I'm going to pass it to Rebecca now, but that is from me. Yes.
Yeah, I would just add that it's kind of starting to understand the value and what service design can do, as Grace was just talking about. And I know from my end, my manager in particular, when she started maybe like close to 2 years ago, I've been here for about a year now. She started advocating for it because she had a background in service design. So she started like showcasing like, this is what we could do with it. Like, let's hire someone on our team to do this sort of thing. So it was a really magical moment where I came in as a new service designer, no one else in my whole business unit doing service design, but everyone was super excited to work with me. They already had a really good baseline of what was possible and what I could potentially do. And so that made a really good environment. And I think just having that type of momentum and be able to showcase like, all right, so this is a map of everything in messaging and how everything connects together. And there's all these people who have been there for years and years that just have this aha moment. And they're like, wow, this is really incredible. Like, I didn't even know this is how it worked. And like, no one's actually made these connections before. I think that's part of what makes it just like keep going. Everyone's like, yes, we need this over here. We need this over here. So now my business unit has like 4 or 5 service designers. We even have some like contracted in because other teams saw what I was trying to do and they wanted to make it happen on their teams as well. So I think that's part of the motivation, just like seeing it working.
So let's pause on that for a second before we talk to Marco, because that is a problem that comes up over and over and over, and somehow you fixed it, you cracked that nut, right? So like people is like, how do I start service design in my company? How do I convince my boss to service design? All those things that we hear all the time, you guys somehow figure it out. You started to doing it, you expose people. So tell us, how was it able to kind of like for you and go from like 1 person to 30 people? Obviously there was an aha moment. How do you create that? How do you generate value? People are just like, oh, we need more of that.
It's a hard thing to answer.
Oh, sorry.
I would just add that, like, I think showing and talking about it is one of the biggest things, like showcasing it, having like one-on-one conversations, talking with managers and leadership, that sort of thing is one way about it. Marco, go ahead.
The only thing that I would add, I think that we had also like kind of a inflection point within the company, because something that happened, I think it was a year-ish ago, is that the design career framework was updated, and among the different disciplines within design, there was a specific vertical specific for service design, which I think was kind of the inflection point, like the almost a touch point between like the bottom up need that designers started to show that, oh, we are having more and more complex topics that we need to tackle, and the recognition from leadership that service design is actually a separate discipline that requires its own way to be assessed, and the fact that we could put a name to it really helped, because now it's a thing and it's not just something that people do on the side or need to sneak in between projects. So I think the simultaneous bottom-up movement of people saying, "Oh, we actually have these skills," and the recognition from leadership that there is a separate path that the designer can take really met into that career framework.
Yeah. Grace, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think definitely I love the top-down, bottom-up approach, Marco, you mentioned. I know that my managers and my leadership definitely knew of the value of service design even before hiring me. And so the leadership does matter. And they're not designers. They are publishing folks who have never touched design, but know that in any case, people need alignment, facilitation, decision-making that is super, super nitty-gritty. And so I loved how you framed that, Marco. Thank you.
I'm going to take a bit of a segue question here because Spotify is notoriously famous for being like very agile, right? So I remember watching a video 10 years ago about how Spotify is super agile, and it was a wonderful video. We also know that a lot of designers and service designers in particular have a very difficult time or have some challenges working with an agile environment because a lot of things we do are sequential by nature. You know, we have to do A before we do B, we do C. So how do you work within a very agile environment, knowing that some of the service design tasks and duties are very much linear and sequential? How do you manage that? Marco, let's start with you this time.
Okay. I think so. I started at Spotify as a contractor, and the first couple of days, people were telling me autonomy is like really one of the core values. And I was like, okay, I get it. But it was not until probably like 2 or 3 weeks in that I really started to get it. I think really that autonomy is like deeply ingrained into the Spotify like culture DNA. And I think it's one of the most important things to understand, like that's part of it. And you need to really like work with it. So I think the approach that I took at least was to understand that was part of the environment and trying really to understand what, like taking an approach where the people that I work with are my customers, because that's really like the case, especially like in the very early projects that I've been working on the Spotify, and really framing that that way of working in terms of autonomy, in terms of agility, in terms of, oh, these are their needs. How can I use my skills as a service designer to serve those needs, right? So like just to make like a practical example, one of the things that like a metaphor that I used doing like the first time with doing research was that of a pipe. We cannot really bring, like if we put in too much information into that pipe, it will explode and we will just make a mess. If we give too little information, it will be irrelevant for our colleagues and customers. So finding that right balance between too much and really just like, this is how things should be done, and you just go in, and like completely like doing too little that it becomes irrelevant, I think was the most important aspect of those early engagements. And as soon as you can provide, you show that your work provides value, I think people are like really keen into like, oh, this is actually helping me. It makes me faster. I make decisions faster. It actually works towards that agility that we want to achieve. So there are tensions, of course, but I think the fact, like being mindful and using like service design skills and tools to actually adapt your processes to where you are, I think is extremely valuable.
So, Rebecca, what is your experience working in the agile environment with your teams?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a couple different thoughts rolling around in my head. One is I don't work so closely into what we call squads. So the squads where it's the engineers executing the work and working with PMs and other product designers. So I'm not necessarily embedded at that level. I'm working more at a strategic level across the part of the organization that I'm in. So I partner very closely with different PMs or like lead PMs of groups of squads. And so because I work at that level, it's not really, the agile part is not affecting me as much. So it's not really in the way, but I would say it's also an asset though, because I think people are very good at shifting directions when we learn new information, or we realize that we don't know the answers as well as we thought we did. So if I'm like kind of poking holes at, well, why are we going this approach? Like, what's the strategy of, why are we doing this strategy in particular? What's the evidence? The teams are really good at like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's maybe rework and rethink our roadmap, which is awesome. So I think the key is just really close partnership with your PMs, in particular, your engineer managers and other strategic partners, like working with a lot of the researchers as well. Like, what are the questions that we're trying to answer and what's coming up on the roadmap? Let's get ahead of that. But mostly I'm working at like that strategic level and helping with the plan of what we're going to do there. And I'm not really focusing on like the day-to-day, how are we going to like ship this particular feature.
Grace, what about you? Are you embedded into a squad? Do you have more like you work with like dev teams, for example?
I work in both different natures. Work with squads, but also internal non-squad mission folks. I think I had to reframe and also understand that being agile is super important, but on the other spectrum, creating the necessary friction to ask the right questions is crucial. That is my role. When we move really fast and really quickly, it's great and of course amazing, but where are those moments where we have to ask those critical questions for clarity is key. But also thinking about folks in licensing and publishing, they're not always super fast, but they are creative in different ways. So how do we kind of match each other's speed is really important. Sometimes my role is like a referee. Putting in those different hats is really, I think, key.
So let's talk about your skill set and where you actually focus every day, right? So let's ask, are you considering yourself more like service design generalist? You kind of cover the whole like double or triple diamond. Are you focused more on the problem space, which is the discovery part? Are you focusing more on the prototyping, ideation part of service design? So tell us a bit, let's finish with your Grace. So where do you fit in the double, triple diamond service design methodology?
It's been a little bit over a year since I joined Spotify, and I have to say it took 6 to 7 months to actually understand the music business. This ecosystem is crazy complicated, and I had mad respect for how things work here because it's been working like this since the Beethoven era, literally. Knowing that, first I came in with like the research mindset. What are we doing? What are the teams? There are projects that are over 100 people sometimes working on one thing. And so orchestrating literally a orchestra could be one, which is the end-to-end. 2, there are micro projects that actually lead to a product where you have to be the researcher, the validator, the tester, but also the project manager. And so it really varies depending on the scope and scale of the project. But because I'm in 2 different natures of mode, I do both. How about y'all, Marco and Rebecca?
Exactly the same. You worded it perfectly.
So is that a good thing or a bad thing, Rebecca? Do you actually enjoy being kind of like doing the end-to-end and being the unicorn, so to speak, or you kind of enjoy focusing more on the research, if that's what resonates with you the most? You have a graphic design background, right? So do you enjoy more the prototyping, ideation part of like making like proof of concept come to life, or you're just more like on a strategic level, as you mentioned earlier?
It's hard to pick one area. I really enjoy all aspects. So I guess that I'm truly am a generalist in that way. But I do like to focus in on certain problems and not have like 100 different things to do at once. So I typically will have like a really big question to answer. What is the current state of the message experience and how do we make it better? So that's kind of been my mandate since I've started. And like I said, I've been here for almost a year as well. So I've been more focused on that beginning stage, as Grace was just talking about as well. It just takes a lot of time to uncover these things. And so you spend a lot of time in that research. And I haven't yet gotten to the ideation phase in that big question. I've gotten to here's the key opportunities that we could go after. And then what would come next is, all right, let's focus in somewhere and choose some spaces and then get into that space. Here and there, though, I have focused in on some specific projects to help a squad or a couple of squads. And that part's fun, too, because you get a little more specific. You get to talk a little more about real solutions and features instead of just like the big idea that's very hard to grasp sometimes. So yeah, I think it's definitely a mix. I didn't give you like a super straight answer. I like all the parts for sure.
Good, awesome. What about you, Marco? Are you more like focusing on one part of diamonds or the whole thing?
No, I have to say I need to not have much to add on this one. I sometimes, in my case, it was more focused on the research and some ideation piece. For some other projects, that were probably a year and change long around compliance. We went from like first conversations with legal, all the way through understanding how the data was structured in our systems, so that we can what could we actually show to creators and to consumers about certain in the UI, all the way to how do we actually implement this. I wasn't like doing like product work, but the level of like zooming in and zooming out was like we went from like maybe like 100 feet to 10,000 feet. And I think I personally really enjoy that. The like a bit of variety. But as Rebecca was saying, the one thing that I think is really helpful for me is where there's like one task or one not task, but one problem area to explore more than two or three at the same time. I think that's where things becomes really tricky when you need to like work in parallel on different problem areas.
Very cool. I'm going to shift gear a little bit and ask a bit of a larger question, right? So we've talked about one of the key power, tool of Service Design is that secret sauce for like alignment, right? Which is really hard to measure, but like one of the best things we do as Service Design is actually create alignment and clarity. It has become the kind of tool for clarity as Spotify. I've talked about this with Marco. So how does Service Design become the main communication tool to bring clarity into a very complex and ambiguous change at Spotify, right? Which is not necessarily where the mind goes to when you think of service design. So explain us how it has become very quickly the one tool that the executive are relying on to bring clarity. Let's start with Grace, if you don't mind.
Yeah, this is a really good question. Because specifically just focusing on my business unit, which deals with everything content. For anything to be on the Spotify platform, we have to have the licenses and contracts in place for the music to stream smoothly. And in those cases, we're totally like the back end has to work. The backstage has to be in line for the front one to even happen. In that case, my clients are both internal and external. And showing them, walking through them on maps that we create together, the end-to-end process of what is now and what could be in the future if we work on X, Y, and Z is really important. Those are the areas where blueprints come into play. Those are the areas where journey maps come into play. And some of our quote unquote clients have never seen this before, but because it is such a straightforward, like visual concept, it's such a powerful tool to kind of bring it to the table. But I also have this like personal vendetta of sorts where I know that maps are not going to always show the problem clearly. It could be too complex, it could be way too dizzy for folks. So we do have to tell that storytelling angle of analyzing, but also synthesizing some of those insights. And therefore, service design becomes the core tool when communicating the impact, but also maybe some risks that are in play or the future ambiguity that we have to kind of iron out. Yeah, that's from my end.
Yeah. So let's talk about for a second. Obviously, you have 15 offices over the world. It's a distributed team, obviously, right? So we used to pre-COVID having those war rooms, those huge blueprints on the wall. You can bring people in and kind of like have this aha moment and kind of like bring that unity of a team in front of a physical blueprint. Obviously, that's not going to work for you. So how are you able to achieve this moment of alignment and clarity with a distributed team, different actors, and how do you manage that on a day-to-day basis?
Do you want me to add, Marco or Rebecca?
Sure.
I think starting small, even one-on-one conversations need clarity sometimes. We think getting everyone in the room is going to solve the issue, but that can be sometimes a waste of time. So who are your leadership who have to make the decision that are not agreeing with you right now? You have to be kind of like a diplomat sometimes and really be a people person to activate those conversations, sometimes even DM them one-on-one if we have to quickly kind of have that key conversation And you have to be open to different channels. Some folks still use GChat, some folks still use email. How do you stay open, but also very, very flexible for your client needs? I think that's the really fun part. We think, the customers are our final clients. Yes, they are. But internally, there's that step-to-step kind of verification process of sorts where you have to unlock conversations. And if you don't have an analogy or like a map of power in place within the workforce, like within your team, meaning who has the final say versus how do we get consensus, it's not going to work out. And so I think internally as service designers, we always have that little map in ourselves, the organizational chart to partnerships, teams. Some of our allies, some of are not not because they're bad people, but because they see something different. And our job is to kind of really bridge those different ideologies. But sometimes it's not in big rooms. It's literally one-on-one conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree. I agree with that system. We always kind of like push the empathy for the users, which is a key of what we do, but we often forget to have empathy for the business, right? So like your stakeholders, your partners also have issues, also have challenges. And some of them, they need you really badly. Some of them are your strong supporters, but they have no authority, right? So it's always nice to have somebody who's like, yeah, this is awesome, Rebecca, do it, but they don't really sign the checks, right? So it's kind of like, okay. Rebecca, do you have anything to add to Grace's statements around this particular question?
Yeah, just like a couple of thoughts. Like, how do we use service design to bring clarity? I think it's a lot of establishing a shared understanding of things where people might know the same things, but think about it a different way. So it's like bridging that technical mind with that business mind, design minds, and having everyone get on the same page, which I think is really important. And then I think something else that we bring to the table as a service designer is the right framings. So Grace was talking about, like you have to synthesize insights. So like using that research part of your skill set and framing things in certain ways and finding the right like strategic way to talk about things or business way, like making sure you have all the parts represented is really important. So you're kind of this like ultimate collaborator and people organizer in a sense. And I think also just like visual representation tends to be really helpful. Some people just talk about it or write docs, but when you get the power of something that's like a map and like making things connect in a way that people never thought they could understand, that's really exciting. And you're uncovering these things that maybe one person on the team knows, but no one else had ever thought of or like knew existed. Those were some of the most fun things when I first started the onboarding process, where I'm just trying to understand how everything works. So I'm making my own maps and models to understand things and asking questions with people. And they're like, oh yeah, that's really cool. Can we put this somewhere to onboard everyone else? Because this makes so much more sense and I understand it now. So I think those are some of the really powerful things that we can do.
Cool. Awesome. Marco, same question.
Yeah, I think, so I think sometimes we use the term like, or like orchestrator, which I think, again, because of the autonomy that we have so deeply ingrained in Spotify, is probably not the best metaphor. The one that I would like use, kind of like, I feel like kind of like what Rebecca was saying, like kind of like an explorer, where I don't have a map. I'm kind of making a map as I go, and it turns out I'm not the only one. So someone will have a very, very deep understanding of this part of the territory, and then like these other folks have a very deep understanding of that part of the territory. But it turns out that no one knows whether there are like bridges or streets or whatever that connects those two territories. I think our role as service designers is kind of first to find out if there are any paths that connects those. And if there aren't, like, how can we start building those bridges? How can we start building those paths? And I think like the fact that we use a lot more like visual artifacts is extremely helpful. And maybe like to one of the first things that you were mentioning at the beginning, Greg, I think the fact, actually, I do believe that the fact that we are distributed empowers us, because if we were to like have to bring people from Spain, New York, Stockholm, London, all into like one room, that would be very expensive. We would probably do that a lot less. And actually the fact that we are distributed and we found ways in which we can leverage the tools that we have available really help us decrease a bit like the friction of making like a very international like room, let's say, and allow us to distribute that a bit over time. So we can have smaller groups in the beginning and then sharing a bit more, and have like larger groups coming in and say, oh, did you think about that? How about this? So that was really helpful. I think also last point is making sure that we ask the right questions is really helpful. I think like that part of being a general is really helpful, but at the same time being aware that you need to study. Like the music industry, as Grace was saying, is extremely complicated in terms of licensing rights and so on. Compliance spaces are also extremely complicated. So you have the permission to ask like the obvious questions, but you need to do like your groundwork and like really like look at the things first.
Cool, very cool. So this was like a very easy, simple question about the ROI of alignment, so to speak. Now let's have a harder question for Grace. Grace, what tangible business value is Service Design bringing as Spotify, right? And I know you are doing this well, so this is definitely something that we all want to know, because this is really hard for most of us to actually get some really strong OKRs or KPI or just basic ROI. But you are doing extremely well. So if you can tell us very practical and realistic things without, doing anything controversial or anything, but like tell us what business value you bring into Spotify through service.
Totally. I think the two areas that I work on is whenever there's changes happening, we have to figure out how we're going to manage change. And then two is like new things. How do I build new things? In those cases, a lot of human power has to move around. We have to really figure out where we can save time, but also costs for maybe, other things like new systems or new hiring and whatnot. And that is actually the core KPI/value that we bring. Having these leads in the table and talking about this new thing that's going to come in the next 2 years, we have to really map that in place so we understand who needs what at what time, when. That is also part of service design. Especially for me in the business affairs unit, that is key because we deal with content. And so, sorry to be generic, but really what's on the slide is exactly what we have to kind of calculate, de-risk if we have to, and communicate. And so there's no secret sauce, really.
Yeah, so how are you measuring those things? Like, you actually have some strict KPI with business, you actually come up with them beforehand, or it's kind of like, what is more like a proactive or reactive?
Totally. Like any other business, every year we have new set of OKRs and goals. That really does trickle down to every decision that we make. And so again, there's no secret Spotify way. I think a lot of businesses do it the same way, but I do think having an understanding of service design helps us think about things at a macro level versus micro level. And as the facilitators of those rooms, drawing out those plans for each team or each project, it is key to kind of keep that in mind. And so how do we ladder up to the work stream, but also the waterfall down effect of whatever that goal comes into play is the way.
Do you have one very concrete success story you want to share? You can share with us about like tremendous business value you were able to bring at Spotify in terms of like whatever, without naming names or.
I think, for example, I can't name a specific project because of combined issues, but just what I talked about in terms of teams, do we need to move people around so that we need a special person who worked on team A who may be needed in team B? How do we stay flexible within the same business unit so that we're not wasting our time, but also HR's time or our finances time and getting those people into place? I think as a facilitator and also just a general people person, I know folks who are passionate about something, who can work on something else if they have a little bit more time. Maneuvering over those things, because we're not an agency, we can't time cap people like that. Knowing what people are interested in, also helping people develop their career path is really important. And so it's literally connecting people in their interests and maybe some new projects together. Sometimes it could be that helping a lot of people who I manage navigate those spaces as well, so we can not only save our time but also get people on the right projects they really want to achieve.
Cool. Very cool. Rebecca, do you have same question? How you bring in tangible business value at Spotify through your line of business, and do you have a specific example to give us?
Yeah. So most recently, what I've been working on is kind of synthesizing my investigation work of what is the messaging experience today, which is very complex. And through that process, kind of ran a series of workshops. I actually did 10 different workshops with various people across our teams outside of messaging, to show empathy on this is what our listeners are actually receiving in their messaging experience, which is something that no one had really seen before. We don't have a way to simulate that. So I did an effort to track that down and figure it out, and kind of did an audit of some users. So trying to give you guys some specific examples of part of this process here. But from that type of work and what I was doing, I got to this point where it's okay, this is what we should be thinking about across all of messaging to achieve our goals. And our goals in messaging is really around, it's a couple different things, but it's trying to help with education and retention, keeping people on our application so that you know how to use Spotify and be happy with it. It's goals on like showing you new things. Like we have audiobooks now, so like who want to try an audiobook if they haven't yet. So trying to understand which users are interested in that. So different goals around that, and like our premium subscriptions and stuff like that are what we think about in messaging area. And so part of what service design is helping to bring to the table is looking across everything, all the different efforts that many people are doing, and putting one lens on it. So like we have people over here focused on this, this, and this. What if we know about all of it and think about it as one strategic sweep in this world of a good messaging experience? So with that, most recently, just kind of like presenting, here's all the like findings and insights and recommendations on where we should go to our leadership in the messaging area. And with that, we're taking this listener focused approach instead of like a very business number approach. So marrying the two. So it's kind of just coming back to that, what I was saying before. It's like you have really good partnerships with the different people with the different expertise. So you have the insights, you have the data, user research, you have the technical needs, and you have the business needs. And so being that facilitator of all those parts is kind of how we get there.
Very cool. Margot, I know you have to go pretty soon. You're in Spain, obviously, so we're going to respect your time. This is the last question for you before you go. What are you and your team? What kind of tangible business value are you bringing to Spotify through your line of business?
Yeah, I think the two main aspects are time to market and operational costs. I will definitely focus more. I can give you like a bit of an example on the second one, just because it's probably less controversial. So when it comes to operational costs, for example, something that was happening within my business unit is that the people that were using the internal tools were using they were using like a fragmented spectrum of like off-the-shelf, semi-internally built like internal tools. And basically, as the content was growing, the number of people that we had to that had to work on understanding the content and looking at it, and sometimes reviewing it, or just like making sure that they interacted with it, were almost growing like linearly with the growth of our content, which clearly is not sustainable, right? So what we wanted to do is really like show how a coherent experience, even for our own colleagues, like internal tools within Spotify, are extremely helpful to be more efficient and be more effective. So one of the things that we were able to do is basically create an internal tool that we built and like we designed and we co-created with the people that are using it. And now that's the main product, the main tool that they use internally. And we were able to basically flatten the curve and be sustainable with the amount of content, so we can allow many more creators on the platform to express themselves, and at the same time make sure that we have a nice and safe and compliant experience.
Very cool. I have one more question for the panel, and we can switch to Q&A. We have a lot of questions already, so let's try to get the last questions. So maybe Marco, you can spare a couple more minutes with us. You can start with you. What are the biggest lessons you've learned at Spotify? How are you communicating the why? We've talked a bit about this before. How are you navigating the generalist specialist dilemma? We talked about as well. And how did you find yourself becoming the sense makers? We'll have a hint to mentors here.
Yeah. I think maybe going back to something that I was mentioning before, one of the main lessons I learned is really how to adapt the tools that you have to make sure that they are valuable and they are effective to the context you're in. I really think like coming in and say this is how things should be done without really understanding the context you're in, first of all, creates frictions that are completely unnecessary, and second, really doesn't set you up for success to provide the value that you want to really show about your work and your discipline within the company. So I think that is like probably one of the most important things that I would like anyone, especially like someone who's new to the career path, don't just take tools and methodologies at face value. Really try to understand, like go back to like, who are your customers? Who are your stakeholders? What are their needs? How can you use your tools and your methods to actually serve those tools and those needs? I can maybe try to get one of the other three, maybe like the generalist specialist one. I think we are generalists in terms of we do not work on one specific part, for example, at least in my case of the service design end-to-end spectrum. But I think we start to specialize more around on the areas that we cover. So in my case, it's more like I was saying, like safety and compliance, which is like just because like the domain and the topic is so complex, you need to gather like in-depth knowledge in order to be able to provide value. Same with Rebecca and all the messaging systems and how we engage with customers, and the same with Grace with licensing, which is really complex domain.
Cool. Thank you, Marco. If you have to go, please. Thank you so much for being part of the panel today. Hopefully we'll see you later. Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Marco. Bye. Take care. Rebecca, same question. What are your biggest lessons that you learned at Spotify? How are you communicating the why, which is always a big question for designers? And we talk about becoming the sense maker and the generalist specialist.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff wrapped in there. I think lessons, like what's been interesting to learn, like service design at Spotify, I came from much smaller companies. And so this is massive for me. And I'd say one of my biggest challenges is to track down the information from the right person. And so it's kind of like this Slack hunt sometimes where it's like, oh, who works on this particular thing? Because I want to learn more about it. And you kind of go down this line of trying to hunt down the person. So the lesson there, I'm not sure. It's just kind of like it takes time to uncover what you're looking for, but people are super willing to chat with you and share knowledge, which is great. The other thing that's exciting and fun and interesting to deal with is we're always doing really cool, innovative things. Like we're always coming up with new features, new things that we're testing, and listeners get really excited about. I think the thing I get asked all the time from friends and family is like, what's new on Spotify? So in the world that I'm in, where we are always coming up with new features and new things to try, people need to communicate that to the listeners when it's ready. And so they do that through messaging. And so that makes it challenging in the world that I'm working in, because you're trying to serve a bunch of customers internally, and your ultimate customer is your end user, which is the listener. So you're trying to protect all of these different areas and bring them together. So I think something that I do to get around that is just always share information. Like, hey, did you know this person over here is working on this? It's very similar to this. Let's talk about it and see where things align. Maybe maybe you can share technology, or we don't have to like create something new, or we already have something that exists for that. So let's save some work. So that's a little bit about like lessons and things I've been learning in my space of service design. I'll pause there.
So can you talk about the Spotify redesign, or is this kind of like a hot topic we can discuss?
That part's not really in my area.
Okay.
Yeah.
I bet Grace can talk about the whole like TikTokification of Spotify. Can you?
I really can't, because that's also not Spotify is huge, but I can talk about the why and the sense making aspect. I think a lot of the folks who go into these projects think we know what we're talking about. I'm not just at big companies. I was in agencies for a long time, but the smartest person in the room usually is the person who asks the right question, and also comes from a place of like, not everyone might know this. So how do we start from the beginning and not make people look like, like they don't know anything? People might just not align on a certain word, time frame, or whatnot. And so that's where the sense making comes into place, where the service designer comes into play and asks the really stupid questions sometimes of like, why are we here again? What are we talking about? What's the goal here? And really clarifying the brief so that people have a North Star to work towards together. The sense making aspect is translating some complicated acronyms and saying, let's not use these anymore. It's just a lot of, complexities where we don't really need complexity, to drawing up some timeframes and timelines and workflow so that people have a clear roadmap to success. The why has to be clear, and we have to kind of break the notion of people know why we're here. Like, we have to really recreate and redesign the gathering, the meeting in itself, so that we end with, okay, next steps, decisions, and whatnot. There are no stupid questions. The service designer is the person who gets the audacity-wise ask those questions, and have that confidence to say, okay, now after this meeting, we're going to leave with really clear 1, 2, 3s.
So you both come from like an agency space when you actually used to have clients. Now you're both working in-house. Do you feel like you have more room, you have more leverage, you have more authority, you have more time? You don't have, you all of you mentioned it takes a long time to understand the music business, unless I'm right. So do you feel like you have less pressure to deliver something within like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, like agencies and consultancies do, right? So when you actually have a contract, you go in, you do your thing, and within 6 or 8 weeks, you're supposed to be delivering X. You don't have that kind of pressure, I'm assuming. So tell us how this is obviously freeing, and what you do is extra kind of like less pressure, so to speak. Whomever.
Time frame wise, probably a little more flexibility, but responsibility wise is a lot more that we have to take into place, because we are working for this one brand, one company, one decision. Like, the level of depth in terms of conversations, not that agency don't go through it, is a little bit more deep, if I may say so. At the end of the day, at an agency, because I've been in one, you hand it off and you hope for the best. You really hope this client takes what you've given to them, whether it's a product, a service, or whatnot. Sometimes they don't really go with that. They go with a different idea, or they change some things in between, and it's like, man. But in-house, everything has to be aligned and kind of decided together for launch. And so I think it's a breadth and depth kind of conversation and answer that I can give you, but passing it to you, Rebecca.
I've actually never worked in an agency. I have always been in-house. I worked for small startups, so I'm used to very fast pace. And that's a little bit different working somewhere at Spotify. It is slower for that reason. There's just a lot more complexity. So yeah, I can't fully answer the question because of that, but happy to.
No worries, it's all good. If you don't mind, if you can spare a few more minutes, we're gonna start with the Q&A. So if you don't mind, Robin, what is the first question from the attendees that you would like to address to Rebecca and or Grace?
Sure thing. I'll go by the upvote count here, and that's the order we'll take them in. Can you share examples of the kind of design tasks you carry out as a service designer in different teams at Spotify?
Design tasks. So like what specific type of work potentially?
However you interpret that, yeah, and we'll see if that answers the author's question.
Okay, I think it's kind of like the whole toolkit of service design depending on the need. Sometimes I'm doing very specific research and assisting with research or running my own research. Other times I'm making a service blueprint or some other version of a map that I've created on my own. Other times facilitation, like a lot of workshop creation and design and facilitation there. Putting together presentations and insight reviews, different stuff like that. And then eventually like helping with like ideation, kind of sketching out with other product designers. I think in any aspect of the design task, I'm always partnering with someone and getting a lot of feedback along the way. We're a very collaborative work environment. So I have multiple design reviews with the rest of my design team. I'm embedded with all other service designer, or not service designers, I'm the only one on my team, but other product designers, UX writers, researchers, and so on. So I think that collaboration is really fun and key.
Grace?
Mine is, I think I mentioned this earlier a little bit, when there's like a big change happening within an existing product or a new product happening. For big change projects, it's kind of like auditing. You go in to see what's been happening for the old world and really kind of double down on what the problems are, whether it's systems oriented, people oriented, process oriented. And then you communicate that back to your internal customers, your stakeholders, your managers, your product owners. And in that sense, you have to kind of be the communicator, the presenter. And so 1 is the researcher hat, where you go in with like, what is the problem? 2 is fixing up everything to make sense of it. And then 3, you're presenting. And so imagine the different 3 phases have each different visual outputs that you have to create, or maybe sometimes don't even need. Those are for the change management ones. New ones, it's like you go in, but also defining the right problem. What are we actually fixing? What are we actually trying to create here? And then go into the research chat, go through all the design thinking phases if you really need to. And so macro-wise and micro-wise, it's pretty much the same. I do think I did study graphic design as my major in college. Having that visual skill set is really helpful, because sometimes you are kind of expected as a title of design to be visual and communicate visually. And so I do want to add to that.
Grace and Rebecca, do you have a few more minutes? We have a couple more questions. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Cool, let's go. Brandon, one more question, please.
The next one up is, what is the connection between product design and service design in your work? So I interpret that as, how is the product design team and the service design team, how do you guys work and play together?
Yeah, I can talk to that. I have a whole group of amazing product designers on my team that I work with, and they're more embedded into squads. So as I was talking about, I'm not in that every day-to-day, what's being developed and launched. They're the ones doing that. And so they're owning that whole experience and owning certain parts of the product. We partner when it gets more of the end-to-end thinking. So we want to figure out, let's see, something that's more specific, like what's the experience with new releases? We talked about that new countdown page that's coming out. So what is the experience end to end with new releases today? What's going on? And so the product designer has the goal to create something new or enhance something in the application itself. And so I have partnered there to say, all right, let's come up with a framework of understanding what's there today and what we need to learn. And maybe we need to map out the technical touch points here and who we need to collaborate with. And so it's kind of help setting that frame or the framework of things, or facilitating conversations, help designing the way workshops go. But product designers are also great at facilitating their own workshops, doing user testing and coming up with the designs, but they're definitely more responsible for that like visual output in the product and the usability of it.
Grace?
Yeah, it's kind of similar. I hand it off to the product designers later down the road. Mine is more so internal work with like aligning and agreeing on things and mapping everything so that we have everything in place before we build something. And so sometimes I don't even work with product designers. It comes very early on. And at times I do work with product designers because it's simply kind of fixing something. And so it varies by product, it varies by initiative and team.
Very cool. Robin, you have one more question for Rebecca and Grace, maybe, before we can close it out?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a few of the questions that are stacked up here, but one that came in pretty early on, and I think it would be a good one for this crowd, is all the speakers are senior designers. Somebody noted that each of you had senior in your titles there. And the question is more around what's the career trajectory for someone in service design within Spotify or generally, and what kind of professional growth do you see good for a service designer starting out?
Should I kick it off?
Yeah, go for it, Grace.
Having the title service designer is my first at Spotify. Before, I was in advertising, I was in design studios, I was at the United Nations, like various areas with various titles. But I think at the core, it did have to do with design research. And when I first began 10 years ago, no one knew what design research was. Everyone still had the, hat of what is design. I think we have to kind of get away from being obsessed with these titles. I do think it is helpful in like having us ground ourselves in our practice now, and it's evolved so much, which is great. In the beginning, whether you're in UX research, you're a graphic designer, all of those methodologies and practices help you become a better thinker in design. And so I think I said in the beginning, I was really interested in business. Like, how do the markets work? How do people actually interact with? I love going to the farmer's market since I was little, just looking at these carrots and seeing who buys these kind of weird looking carrots. That curiosity really drives you. And so how you frame your practice is up to you. Again, and if you're early on, don't think about those like service design X titles or whatever title. Like, you will learn everything you need to learn as you grow. And so that's a little bit of tips from me. How about you, Rebecca?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of a hard question to answer, but I agree with Grace. Like, you kind of have room to shape how you want your career to be, even within service design. We got all these great questions about like what part of the double diamond do you like to work within? A few of us like to do all of it, but other people maybe just want to focus in certain areas. And I think that's totally fine. I think the parts that are unique about service design is what you can like learn about. Like, you need to know some things about business, you need to know some things about technology, you need to know like all these different areas and be able to pull things together and have certain skill sets around clarity and sense making and really good communication skills, working with many different people within the business. At Spotify in particular, as far as like leveling up in your career, we have that framework that we talked about. And it kind of is just expanding your reach in a sense is part of it. So like for me, I work at this level of messaging, and then we have all these different layers, like it's the product area. And then after that, it's the tribes. There's a bunch of different tribes at that level. So for me to level up, I'd start working across the whole tribe. So you're getting out of something that's as niche and getting more and more broad and more broad and more broad. And so that's kind of how our career framework is set up in a sense. That's like one aspect of it. So hopefully that helps give you guys some things to think about.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think we're out of time. Unfortunately, we have a ton of questions, and no question we're going to be handling that. So this session is recorded, will be on YouTube probably tonight or maybe tomorrow. If you want to go and ask your questions in the comments of YouTube, you can do so. And obviously Rebecca, Grace, and Marco can answer within the comments. That's one way we can do this probably. Meanwhile, Rebecca, Grace, and Marco, thank you so much for letting us take a look inside Spotify and how you guys do things and how you do it and how you're successful at doing things. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's always really hard to actually get into a company and kind of like get the inside view. A lot of the things we do are highly proprietary. We can't really talk a lot about the stuff we do. So I really appreciate the fact that you are giving us a glimpse behind the curtain of Spotify. Again, thank you so much, Rebecca, Grace, and Marco. Looking forward to hear back from you maybe in the future. We can do this again maybe next year and see what's changed, how many needles have moved at Spotify between today and next time. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Good luck for the delivery, hopefully soon, and then let us know if it goes well. Thank you, Grace. Have a beautiful evening, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.